I hope you're doing well, and
yeah, I do. Well. Thank you.
Okay, if you're ready, we can start the discussion.
Yes, please.
Thank you.
I don't know what you expect from me, but please, let's start. Let's just start.
Yes, sure. I'll give a very brief introduction to the subject, and then we will start with your lecture, and afterwards a Q&A session.
Okay.
So I would like to welcome everyone to this event. It's a great honor for us to host Professor Hannes SWOBODA, President of the IIP, International Institute for Peace in Vienna. And we, of course, have been fortunate to have him before via these Zoom meetings. We had a joint webinar together, and which was a very fruitful discussion and resulted in further cooperations between the two institutes. Today, we are specifically focusing the discussion on European the security cooperation between Europe and Iran, the opportunities, the challenges that exist. Following the war in Ukraine, many analysis and discussions about security perceptions of Europe have been produced, and many analysts believe that Europe has become more sensitive about security concerns after the Ukrainian crisis and the conflict. And we have witnessed that, for example, in Germany, there is discussion about new emphasis on the importance of deterrence, the importance of energy security, a necessity to look again at the security strategy of Europe, further cooperations about European states, with regards to, of course, it's building a stronger NATO. What we would like to know today, and we hope that through our discussion we would be able to build on that, is what is Europe's perception about the role of the Middle East, and more specifically Iran, in this whole change of dynamics across the world? And how can, what are the potentials for, because we are seeing renewed interest in the region, not just in terms of energy, but also in terms of the migration crisis and other aspects of the issue that we will discuss later on. So how will this renewed interest affect Europe's perception of the Middle East, and more specifically Iran, and the security cooperation that can take place between the two regions, and in terms of deterrence or in terms of other aspects of security concepts? The floor is yours, Mr. SWOBODA.
So I don't know how long I should speak, but I just start and you will then interrupt me. Well, you started yourself with the question of the war in Ukraine, in Europe, in the heart of Europe. It is more or less the heart of Europe if we don't think only about the European Union. And that, of course, is what somebody called, especially the German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, will bring a Zeitenwende, change in the times, in the general political framework. Because we see that one country is attacking another country. You have your own experience, different kind of war, but between Iran and Iraq, without any possibility first to negotiate, to talk about some compromise. If you look in detail, it is more or less clear that the reason of the war is not that Russia just wants to take Ukraine or parts of Ukraine, but it's some sort of a global competition where Russia is not satisfied with the position the United States or the West in general has globally. And on the other hand, Russia thinks the West is weak, morally weak and can be beaten, and the West is not united and is divided. So this war could be won more or less easily. Well, we saw that this was not possible. Russian troops got a lot of resistance from the people in Ukraine, not only from the military, but from the citizens. Majority of it. Of course, there are always some citizens who just think they have to be on the side of Russia because they feel themselves less Russian. But the big majority, also in the east, not only in the west, but also in the east of Ukraine, is resisting. It's another example where a small country can resist foreign intervention if it is united. And Russia made it even more united than it was before because of that aggression. And we have, of course, different other examples. And whatever we say, you can say Iraq, you can not with Vietnam, Afghanistan. So the belief that you just have a strong military and you're just bigger and then you defeat a small country is very often not well founded. What does it mean for Europe? For Europe, it meant to be united and quick. Already in the COVID-19 situation, Europe relatively quickly acted. It needed some time, some weeks, even some months, but then by organizing jointly the vaccines, European Union showed some strength and unity. But this time it was in days that the sanctions have been decided, in days that it has been decided to support Ukraine, even with military equipment. So that makes a bit of difference in the European Union. The European Union is a basic idea that neighbors should work together and not fight each other, as Europe was characterized over many centuries. And of course, especially the First World War and the Second World War were typical examples of fighting each other. And then the United States came and made the difference from the one or the other side. So this is the first point. Europe is much stronger, for the moment at least, than it was before. Of course, on some elements, especially on weapons, Europe is depending on the United States. The nuclear issue, and here we come slowly also to Iran, the nuclear issue is one where the United States is, of course, much more equipped and able to defend itself or to meet the Russian threat, because you know that Mr. Putin threatened to use nuclear arms. So there are nuclear arms, especially with France, and already outside the European Union with the Great Britain, United Kingdom. But that big question of who would, in case of a nuclear attack, be really able to push back this attack by Russia is, of course, the United States in the framework of NATO. And in some way, and this can be seen positively or negatively, the European Union has been pushed more in the hands, or has been, let's say, pushed to strengthen the ties, the links with the United States. Mr. Biden made it very clear. It's a difference, Mr. Biden, than to Mr. Trump, but there's a strong coordination on this way. I said that Europe is stronger for the moment. Yes, it's stronger because it's more united and can quickly act. Of course, economically, we will also suffer. The European Union decided sanctions, and sanctions normally always, especially strong sanctions as we have them against Russia, are also weakening European Union companies. It's not sanctions, it can never be only one-sided, you know perfectly well, as you have for a long time been already on the sanctions regime. it is also a suffering for Western or for European companies. Secondly, the rising prices of energy, not only of energy, but also of food, which is a big disaster for European Union, but for even more, of course, for North Africa, for the Middle East, for Africa, for some Asian countries who depend very much, especially on wheat, but also on sunflower oil, etc. So this is also weakening. And the rising energy prices is weakening all the countries who are importing energy and are depending on importing energy. And that, of course, is especially true for the European Union. Now, there are some determination to block the oil export from Russia. Not yet really decided, because there are some countries who are vastly dependent on oil from Russia and cannot switch easily. And of course, the big issue is gas. There are some countries already who say, let's stop gas imports. Some countries are not supporting it, especially Germany, Austria, and some other countries who are strongly dependent on gas. You know that Mr. Putin blocked already gas exports to Poland and Bulgaria. This was not a big problem because Poland already was switching over to especially liquefied gas, natural gas, and in Bulgaria is totally dependent on Russian gas, but can switch relatively easily to gas imports coming from Greece and other countries. And it's not a huge country with huge demands on oil, on gas. So, but this is an issue. So for the moment, European Union is hesitant in blocking imports from Russia, and Russia is hesitant in blocking export because that would be a big suffering on the Russian side. So Europe is on the search for a new gas coming, in parallel, of course, to measures of energy saving, of sustainable energy sources from wind and solar, going in the direction of e-mobility, where we don't need gasoline, but have batteries. But everybody knows that the battery technology is not yet very mature. It's still a long way to go to have a long distance batteries. And of course, also on hydrogen, to produce hydrogen, but again, you need capacities and you need also a distribution network for hydrogen. So, of course, the European Union will fasten and will be much stronger in going in the direction of alternatives to the to gas and oil. But of course, it will need time. So in time, we need new gas and oil. Something will come. Some will come from United States. United States is quite well equipped. Of course, we are not. Those who are interested in the environment are not very, let's say, very happy about the fracking system, which brings this gas out of the certain deep soils. And we're looking for other alternatives, especially for liquefied nuclear gas, like from Qatar. The United States, you know, was even considering to get some oil and gas from Venezuela, which is under sanction regime. And of course, it would be very helpful to have a new agreement, a nuclear agreement along the JCPOA with Iran, because that would, of course, give the oil and gas market a new push and new resources. Now, the news we have in Europe is that, of course, especially Russia is trying to prevent somewhat this agreement if it could, if there would be some pressure on Iran not to be some sort of an exit for trading certain goods with Russia to circumvent the sanctions imposed by the West. But on the other hand, also I know that the Republicans still in the United States are quite hesitant to give Mr. Biden the, let's say, the chance to come to an agreement with Iran. And of course, there's still the pressure from Israel, but I think the pressure could not be strong to prevent a new agreement if inside the United States the climate would be more for an agreement, and if perhaps the Russian pressure that any kind of agreement must not involve some passages about some arguments or articles about free or preventing free trade between Iran and Russia in order to prevent circumvention of the sanction regime. Overall, you know that the European Union is interested in security for all the countries, especially also for Israel, because of the past relationship and the past horror committed by European countries, not European Union countries, because the European Union was not existing, but especially by Nazi Germany on Jews. There's a special relationship, you know it, and it cannot be denied, and there are some justification. Also, again, the tolerance about what Israel is doing to the Palestinians is not justified by what the Europeans did to the Jews in Europe. Overall, I think United States and the European Union will not be as attentive and as focused on the Middle East for the moment as it is more focused on the war in Europe, and a bit focused on how China is doing or looking at the war, because China in some ways on the winning part. We will see how strong it's on the winning part, and of course the West is not very eager to see another war, the one between China and Taiwan, or the let's say the war or the efforts of China to bring Taiwan into the Greater China, which is in some way can be seen parallel to the Ukraine issue. So I think if I would look to the focus and give a priority, a ranking of the focus, I would say that the focus on Ukraine is focus number one. Focus number two is China and South China Sea, Taiwan, and the whole area there. And only focus number three is the Middle East. The Middle East in the sense of trying to get more oil and gas from the countries, also in order to lower the gas price. Here you know that there have been discussions with Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia is not very keen because it was in a bit, let's say, especially with Mr. Biden, not in a very good, happy relationship, as Mr. Biden criticized some of the Saudis' events and actions, including also the war in Yemen. But overall, that's realistic to see that the attention will be less focused on the Middle East, which of course means that let's say the supply of oil and gas from the Middle East will not be as strong as the West would wish it. That's for the moment, I would say, for my introduction, but of course I can go more into details, but I would not go too much into it before you say what your interest or what your questions are. So overall, to conclude, the European Union is in a bit in a limbo. Strong on the one hand, strongly determined to support Ukraine in this war, Of course, in time, also voices will come, how can we stop the war if we see that neither side can really win? And how can a peace solution be here? The second element is a strong strength on the energy transition, so it's more sustainable energy, but in the meantime also trying to get as much as oil and gas from other sources, including from the Middle East. Europe would be interested, of course, overall to have an agreement on the Iran, on the nuclear issue with Iran, to re-establish some sort of a GCPOA. But here, I think both Russia and United States have some hesitations out of different reasons, of course, or maybe sometimes even the same reason, fearing that Iran will be a exit or indoor a possibility to overcome or to evade and avoid the sanctions. But that's for the moment what I have to say, with all the most attention European Union on Ukraine, secondly on the China and Southeast Asia Sea area, and only thirdly on the Middle East. But if I should elaborate somewhat more, please tell me.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your comprehensive introduction to the discussion. You mentioned that the US is looking for ways to compensate for the deficit in the oil and gas market through providing the energy resources itself, or asking Qatar or Venezuela. And of course, Saudi Arabia has not so far abided this request. But how about other areas of cooperation? Do you see that, do you think that the war in Ukraine has given higher importance to some of the aspects of and fields of cooperation, security cooperation between Europe and the Middle East, or has it somehow decreased the importance of these areas of cooperation? For example, with some other areas such as migration, the spillover effects of the conflicts in the Middle East can, let's say, exacerbate the ongoing migration crisis due to the war in Ukraine, can add to that problem. And there are other areas such as the transfer of oil and gas through the Persian Gulf, and also the maritime security. So do you think that if you want to enumerate some of the areas of concern and interest for Europe that have existed, of course, so long, but do they still remain this? Do they still have the same, let's say, weight for Europe, or are there any increased interest in some of these areas, or are there, let's say, some new fields and areas of concern and interest that require cooperation between the two regions?
Well, as far as I understood, because connection was not very good partly, let me mention some elements of it. Concerning the refugee flows, I think this is a bit in the back, the refugee coming from Middle East, even from Africa, a bit in the backyard, so to say, because now the refugee issue is one of the Ukraine refugees. They are seen a bit different. They're seen more like, you know, from the same cultural, whatever community. And the war is, of course, closer to us. So it's a bit of what I would say a discrimination. We can see positive discrimination towards refugees from Ukraine, with the hope they will return very soon, and a bit negative discrimination in relation to the other people coming from the Middle East, from Syria, or from Afghanistan and other countries. Maybe overall it will come to, let's say, recognition that Europe, because of its economic strength, is always an immigration area, immigration continent from wherever it will come. So, but for the moment, the immigration issue in the sense of the public debate as we had it in the past years is not happening. Maybe after some time, if people feel that their job has been taken away and so on, it may change. But for the moment, we have quite a lot of job demands from the companies and not so much offer from the side of the citizen. Therefore, it will not distort the labor market, as some East Europeans went back to their own country. Some East Europeans are quite happy, like I heard from Bulgaria or even Romania, that people coming from Ukraine, maybe from Moldova in the future. So this kind of filling up empty places and empty spaces in Europe, in Eastern European countries is seen different than before. I just read that Hungary, unfortunately, is still discriminating and is totally differently treating refugees from Ukraine than refugees from other areas of the world. So I don't say refugees is not an issue, but it's not a public debate normally, with very few exceptions. On the energy issue, as I said, Europe is very strongly in a transition process. And we hope that we can vastly reduce energy demand in general, and especially energy demand concerning gas and oil in the near future. Most of the plans are going until 2027, whatever, so 2030. Anyway, we will go much faster in trying, at least, we will much faster trying to avoid the use of gas and oil by different alternatives. Also, I must say that people are not always happy if they have a wind turbine near their house standing. People are not always happy if there are too many solar panels also on the ground. And the technology for developing different batteries is still open the discussion which kind of battery should it be. And of course, the development of hydrogen production to use as energy will need some time. So for the next 5 to 10 years, there will be a strong still dependence on oil and gas. And therefore, of course, the Middle Eastern area and the whole Persian Gulf and all the area is of great importance. And of course, we know that there is a competition, that other countries want, of course, gas and oil as well. India, as a big country, will strongly continue to receive their sources, the hydrocarbons from Russia, China partly. But in that sense, the Middle East is in a, let's say, is for us sensitive, because if there will be real blockage of energy coming from this area, it will be still a disaster. With all our orientation going into the direction of alternative energy, it will be still a disaster. And therefore, it could be also a big mistake if we are distracted from giving attention to the Middle East. And therefore, I think Europe is interested. Also, therefore, Europe is interested in having an agreement with Iran on the nuclear issue, because it would, and of course, lifting the sanctions, that's obvious, because it would stabilize the situation. We follow quite closely any kind of, let's say, contacts, also of Iran with some of the Arab neighbors, not yet on a high level, but still there are some contacts which we appreciate very much. And of course, we have to look also at Turkey. Turkey is trying to get a new foreign policy, new foreign economic policy, in trying to improve its relationship with some of the Arab countries, with Qatar, but also now with Saudi Arabia, with Egypt. And I personally would appreciate, of course, very much if Turkey would be involved in all the energy resource explorations in the Eastern Mediterranean. And here the Cyprus issue is still an open issue, but maybe that also this issue can be solved, because that again would bring and would offer some energy for also the European market. If Turkey, Greece, Cyprus, Israel, Palestine, Egypt, these countries will also be involved in a common and joint venture concerning energy and gas exploration in the Eastern Mediterranean. Yeah, that's for this, as far as I understood your questions.
Thank you very much. So we also delved into other aspects and issues that can pose as areas of common security cooperation. How would you, apart from the JCPOA and the non-proliferation issue, what other issues do you see as areas of common interest between Europe and Iran, regardless of whether or not the deal is survived? Do you think, first of all, is it solely dependent on the survival of the deal? And also, in case the deal, even if it's not survived, do you see chances of cooperation in other areas?
Well, Iran is, of course, involved itself directly or by proxy by Hezbollah in different neighboring countries. Now, let's start with Lebanon. I think Europe is very much interested in having stability in Lebanon. You know that Lebanon is a disastrous political but major economic and social situation. There is too much corruption, too much infighting still, and always difficulties to form governments and so on. So I think it would be very, very welcome if inside, of course, Lebanon, people would sit together and not fight against each other, but try to find solutions and economic reforms. People are suffering, people are partly big hunger, and especially after the disastrous explosion. It's still, it's not a big country, but first of all, it's a country I personally like very much, but it's a country that could be an example of coexistence, cooperation between Shia, Sunnis, Christians, different groups. So I think, of course, any dialogue with Iran should also concentrate, or should also affect the question of Iran. On Iraq, we would also need stability. You know that in Iraq, they're still fighting. It's not fighting against the US so much, but a fighting between different groups. And not a strong stability. There would also be to be found some stable relationship between inside Iraq, between the regional government in the north, mainly run by the Kurds, and by the rest of the country, which was good for, of course, for the export of oil and gas. And then, of course, Syria. Now, it is very difficult, I must often say, for any country to work together or to have some sort of a improved relationship with Mr. Assad. Nevertheless, some Arab countries are starting and has a huge demand for reconstruction. I don't know who wants to do it. Iran has not, I think, the financial and economic capacity to do it. Russia has not the capacity. Now it's even less. Even if it takes, let's take it, that it takes some parts of Eastern Ukraine. The funny thing is that Russia is destroying the infrastructure, the buildings. Even in that part, it says it's our part. So it will be a huge demand. Of course, the West will have a demand on Russia to help the whole reconstruction in Ukraine, because they destroy it in many areas in Ukraine. But Russia is not in a strong economic well-being. So I don't know if Arab countries or will, out of their oil income and gas income, which will be shrinking in the future, not now because of high prices, but will be able to do it. So, and then of course, Yemen, which is the same thing. I think that this kind of policies of destruction, I think, you know, I'm a very much strong supporter of European Union, and many things do not work so well in European Union. But I think the real message is that you have to overcome these mutual destructions you have. And you have that now again, unfortunately, between Russia and Ukraine, or more Russia on Ukraine, because of course Ukraine cannot destruct much in Russia, but it's also self-destruction. Because we see how many people, how many Russian soldiers die, how much money has to be spent on that war for nothing, And so the same is, of course, true for the whole region in the Middle East, or not the whole region, but especially Iraq, Iran, Syria, and Lebanon. And I think unless you come out of that kind of mutual distrust, mutual animosity, and go for strong cooperation, I don't see any peaceful situation in the whole Middle East, at least in the countries I mentioned. It will be not so much in the Emirates, in Qatar, in Saudi Arabia. If you think alone how silly it was to try to punish Qatar, partly punish Qatar because it has better relationship with Iran than Saudi Arabia and the Emirates had. But did it bring? Nothing. It did bring nothing. At least there was no destruction. But I think the big issue is how to find a way, not of course to be friends and brother and sister from one day to another, but at least to live together and to help those who suffer. The Palestinians suffer enormously. The Syrians, most of them suffer. Not the corrupt part. You perfectly know very well there's a strong corruption. There's strong winners of the war, but they are minority. It's not the majority. In Iraq, it's a bit different, but still, and in Lebanon, it's the same. There are some rich people in Lebanon on all sides, and there are some people who are not losing, but the vast majority of the people are losing because of the unwillingness to overcome the disputes of the past.
Yes, I agree, man. Let's hope that in the future we will witness a better environment for better relations, so that, as you said, mutual distrust will be eradicated. So let's move on to the Q&A. My colleagues here have several questions regarding the topic of the session. Mr. ANVARI from the German program. Mr. ANVARI, please.
Guten Tag, Herr SWOBODA.
Guten Tag.
Hören Sie mich?
Ich höre Sie, ja.
Ja, also vielen Dank, dass Sie da sind. Vielen Dank, dass Sie unsere Einladung angenommen haben. Vielen Dank. Und auch vielen Dank für Ihre Präsentation. Ich wollte wissen, was die Europäische Union wirklich zur Rettung, zur Wiederbelebung von dem Atomabkommen zwischen Iran und dem Westen also machen kann und zurzeit macht. Weil ich also, wenn ich Sie richtig verstanden habe, haben Sie das auch erwähnt, dass die Wiederbelebung, die Rettung von diesem Abkommen auch von der Europäischen Union an mehr Bedeutung gewonnen hat, wenn ich Sie richtig verstanden habe. Und jetzt also gibt es auch also neue Impulse, neue Versuche seitens der Europäischen Union, also irgendwie zwischen dem Iran und dem Westen zu vermitteln oder zu versuchen. Gibt es also neue Versuche, die also erwähnenswert sind? Vielen Dank. Und wenn es möglich ist, dann möchte ich jetzt also meine Frage kurz für meine Kolleginnen und Kollegen auf Persisch übersetzen. Und dann höre ich gern Ihre Meinung von Iran.
Soll ich in Deutsch oder in Englisch antworten?
Ja, English also
Okay.
ist möglich, also wenn es möglich ist.
Gut.
من سوالم در مورد تلاش اروپا بود برای احیای برجام. پرسیدم که با توجه به اینکه فرمودید اهمیت جدیدتر بیشتر پیدا کرده مسئله برجام برای اروپا به لحاظ اهمیتی، تلاشایی که اروپا در حال حاضر داره انجام میده برای احیای برجام رو اگر مورد خاصی در واقع به لحاظ تحلیلی هست ذکر بفرمایید. Bitte schön, ich höre gern. Wir alle hören gern, bitte.
Yeah, thank you very much for your question. I don't know if there are many, many initiatives, and I don't know if these initiatives would really bring some fruits and results. Because as I said, initiatives from the side of the European Union, because as I said, the main obstacles just in Russia and in USA, because we are not interested in any country to have a free, transit line to Russia to overcome and to avoid the sanctions. But of course, there are other countries anyway, like China or especially India, has a different interest, and we have to recognize that. And I think Europe more and more sees that it's not a majority of citizens or countries representing a majority of the world's citizens who are actively sanctioning Russia because they have other interests. We have to recognize that the West in general, USA, but also Europe, was not always very representing high moral standards, especially when we think about the colonial times and some post-colonial activities. So we are not the ones who always have justice and the right direction and the right policies on their side. But again, in this case, Europe is very much interested in stopping the war, as we don't want to fight directly, because a fight between NATO and Russia could be a disaster, could be a real world war. So it's always a limbo and always a way to try to support Ukraine, but not to give any reason for Russia to attack a NATO country, because then it would retaliate. It would have to retaliate. Otherwise, NATO would not make any sense. But it's not in the hands of the Europeans to come to a decision. It's in the hands of the US as the big partner and Russia, because it's an agreement. I think China would also be interested in it, because overall, it would bring more stability on the oil and gas market. Of course, Russia maybe is not so much interested, as it has not an interest to lower the gas and oil price. They want to keep it high, because then they have high income, at least, to finance their war. The US is different. Of course, high gasoline prices are a burden and can bring some negative results at the midterm elections for Mr. Biden. Of course, the gas price should be not too low, because then fracking would not be profitable. But the US President Biden and the administration has some interest, but it's the Republicans who block it still. And he is, I think, a bit hesitant before the election to come to a solution, but I think it's wrong. Biden should come very clearly to have an agreement. And if the US and Russia would not come to an agreement, I would still say the European Union should go for an agreement itself. But I fear the European Union will not do it because it would bring a strong split between EU and Russia and the US, and that's at that time not what one's to see. So the real alternative, if the US is still not going for an agreement, would be to go it alone. But this is a personal opinion, and maybe some others would share it, but it will not bring, and it would, of course, not lift the sanctions of the US against Iran. It would even could bring secondary sanctions on European companies who would do trade with Iran on issues or in goods which are the sanctions. So this, let's say, alternative to go it alone for Europe will not be implemented.
Thank you very much. Mr. Anvari, do you have other questions? Okay. So let's move on to Mr. KAMRANI, our researcher from the UK program.
Hello there, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh, okay. So good morning to you in Vienna. Thank you for joining the talk with us. I would like to start with actually addressing a point you have just mentioned about the new approach that Europe might be having over JCPOA, its revival, and the probable outcome from within the long-term probably scope. But there is another thing that could be in the interest of European countries, and that's the fact that there is this kind of an arm race starting in the region, and which I see that it has been reflected in actually the talks from the politicians or think tanks, and that's over the arms over the drone and the missile and the probable proliferation to other parts of the region. And that Europe has concern that this could actually mean I don't know, some kind of miscalculation or some probable future disastrous events when it comes to exacerbating the problem over more and more regional actors with this kind of missile approaches. So I would like to see if Europe and you, I mean, you like personally or in the EU or so from the matter of actually subjectivity, is this a real concern for the Europe as it's coming by or not?
Well, thank you very much for this interesting question. Let me perhaps a bit elaborate. The European Union is a union which is basically not a military union and will not become a military union, and was very much interested in disarmament and to have that soft power as the major instrument of international politics. Now, I fear that with the Ukraine war, there's some change in it, that the soft power issue will be pushed back, and now it's about arms, and you have to have arms in order to defend yourself against aggressive neighbors. And you know that even in Germany, who was very cautious because of the past and because of the aggressive policies in the past, First World War, Second World War, to have a low-key arms policy, so to say, or defense policy. This will certainly change. I don't know how much it will change, but it will change. The European Union itself will not build up a strong military. There will be some rapid reaction force, minor issue. There will be some common defense policies, but of course inside NATO. And you see that two countries probably will join NATO in addition, that's Sweden and Finland, in the north, because they feel threatened by Russia. And it is strange, but how short-sighted Putin is, that with this war, he is strengthening NATO, not defeating NATO, but strengthening NATO. But okay, that's his problem, so to say. So I fear that in some way it will go even in more armament than disarmament. Now, of course, one can say the war will have to end some way, sometime. I don't know how it will end, with a new borderline. People speak it will end like Korea, you know, some borderline and demilitarized zone, and that's it for many decades. But the question is, what's afterwards? If you stop this war, it doesn't mean that wars are stopped overall. As I said, we have fightings in the Middle East, we have a fight in Ethiopia. It's not the only war in the world. Now, the most critical neighborhood for us is, and I want to come back to the first question, of course, is the issue of the region of the Middle East. You know that many Europeans, not all, but many Europeans would be very interested in a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East, because we always fear, and that's one of the elements, that if Iran would get nuclear arms, then Saudi Arabia would say, what about us? And Egypt would say, and we have a region full of nuclear arms. And I think that that's one issue we should still have on our mind, even if it's very unrealistic for now. But as you said and mentioned, there are, of course, many other arms. The new arm of today, so to say, are the drones, where especially Turkey was very active in delivering drones, and you know that the war in Nagorno-Karabakh was more or less decided, so say military experts, for Azerbaijan because of drones delivered by Turkey, and now drones, of course, help Ukraine more than Russia even to sustain the attack by Russia. Overall, I think after this war, what would have to come, of course, is a new round of disarmament issues, including NATO and Russia, but of course also for the very critical region in the Middle East. Because the war, again and again, we have said about this, I have mentioned this very tragic war in Yemen, is not really bringing citizens anything, without destruction, death, pushing them back decades even in the economic development. So I think you're absolutely right. I don't see many, let's say, efforts outside the European Union to concentrate on disarmament, especially on disarmament also on the Middle East. But I think it would be enormous. What I think, and therefore I mentioned it, what we need, of course, is not only you know, a round of disarmament, but to develop, and here, of course, Iran is an indispensable partner for it, a development, what could be the peace structure and order in the Middle East. This is what, you know, the European Union was founded after the Second World War, when courageous politicians said, let's stop this cycle of wars again and again. I mentioned the First and the Second World War, but there were always wars before, on the Balkans and different, you know, wars. So I think that is, that is, I think, the big issue, to think we will not stop any kind of conflicts or dividing issues. But there are so many issues we could work together on energy. Not only, of course, on energy and gas and oil, you know perfectly well, if you don't like these two countries working together, but Israel and Emirates and other countries are working also on the hydrogen issue, because at the end of the day, we need also these alternative technologies. And you, especially with countries on the sea, they can bring desalted water. You know perfectly well also in Iran, you have the environmental issue. Many regions in Iran are specifically affected by droughts and by lack of rain and water. And so there are so many issues. One has to work together. And less spending on arms could mean more spending in the interest of the citizens. But of course, less spending on arms would afford first some basic understanding on solving conflicts peacefully in dialogue and not leading to wars. Not also European Union was not built from the start. It was developing, and I don't see a European or a Middle Eastern Union now for the next time, but at least to have that kind of dialogue. Of course, with the between Arab countries and Iran, concerning especially countries where you have to work together, or where you live together, from Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, and other countries. And then finally, but I know this is a big non-starter for the moment with Israel, as it is there, but of course with the demands for solving the issue with the Palestinians, because the Palestinians also have a right to have a country and to have a state and to have the same rights for water, for mobility, for whatever, as all the other citizens in the region. So yes, that's my answer, but you're absolutely right. Disarmament in general would be a big, big issue. And if you think about the drones, they will not disappear, but also here some, how should I say, some equality of drones availability for the different countries would be necessary, because the drones are relatively cheap, and it would be an imbalance could again bring new wars. So I think what is important with disarmament is, of course, not to avoid that there are arms and arms availability, but that the arms should be distributed in a balance in relation or in combination with some issues like to solve conflicts. If it's not, if you don't want the example of the European Union, you could take the example of the OSCE, which for the moment is blocked because of Russian blockage, but sometimes those other countries may have blocked it, but some sort of, as it's called, an organization for security and economics, economic cooperation for the region, whatever. I think fantasies can be here without limitations.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your response to the questions. We have further questions from my colleagues, but let's wait. I think they are about to raise hands. Okay, till they ask their questions, I would also want to mention another issue that you talked about during your replies to the questions, the issues of climate change and how it's affecting the region, so in Iran as well, and how this can provide an area of cooperation. Of course, I think there has been attempts in the past, for example, between European companies and even Iran, to build on the capacity for renewables. However, due to the sanctions, these attempts have not been successful. Do you see any chances of renewed attempts if these problems, these sanctions are not solved, are not removed, let's say?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. The environmental issue is a big one. And I think the sanctions, at least on this issue, should be lifted immediately, because we cannot have the argument, it's also in the Paris Agreement, we have to have a global policy against environmental damage and then have this kind of sanctions. Again, I think, of course, the agreement should be done very, very soon. But I think we speak about the overall sanctions we have against Russia, and that's very unique. But also the sanctions against Iran have been very punishing in many effects. So it's not so unique from the Western side. And again, if there is an agreement more or less on the table, I would think we should go for it. Now, I can imagine that it's unrealistic to demand that all the sanctions will be lifted before any agreement can be found, but at least some of the sanctions should be immediately lifted. All sanctions which in effect deteriorating the health situation, the environmental situation, and which are not starting to get new. We should start to get new initiatives, because anyway, if sanctions are lifted, it needs some time. Companies are coming, or companies have the courage to come or establish new possibilities on the ground. So I think some of the sanctions which are really affecting negatively the humanitarian and environmental situation of the citizens of Iran should be lifted immediately. And Europe should have an initiative on that, because again, it needs time until all the investments can be made, that the companies are interested in it and so on. So especially in that time when our main issue is to defend Ukraine against Russia, European Union must look more to the other regions and build some trust with the other regions. We know perfectly well, for example, that concerning, as I mentioned in the beginning, that the wheat exports from Ukraine, and partly from Russia, but especially from Ukraine, is so damaged that some countries like Egypt, like Tunisia, and so on, are strongly depending on wheat exports, and we have to help them. And I don't know exactly all the details about the exports going to Iran, but Iran is in such a difficult situation of so many years of sanctions, and it's not the government who is suffering, it's the people who are suffering, and we have to help them. This is the minimum, and I think the European Union should insist that at least some of the sanctions are immediately lifted, as long as Iran is in principle ready to come back to an agreement. And if the agreement is not, the fact that the agreement is not concluded is not depending on Iran, but on the US or on Russia, it must not be that Iran is punished for that. So this is the reason. I may come back also to the question from a colleague before. This, I think, is an initiative European Union should take. To take out some of the sanctions already now, even if there's not yet an agreement fulfilled, as long as Iran is ready to go for the agreement.
That's absolutely great. Thank you. My colleague, Ms. Rezai, would like to ask a question. She's from the European Union program. I think, Ms. Rezai, we cannot hear you well. So please unmute. It's not.
Are you hearing me?
Yes, now I hear you.
Thanks for your presentation. The European Union, through different military and civil projects and missions in different areas of the world, tries to reduce its security concerns. Considering security concerns of European Union in the Middle East and Iranian capacities and capabilities in management of borders, fighting against different kinds of trafficking and illegal immigration and asylum management, there are numerous possibilities for potential security cooperation between Iran and European Union. But there is no effective practical cooperation. I want to know, in your opinion, what are the main obstacles of security cooperation between Iran and European Union, both short-term and long-term? Thank you.
Well, in long term, there shouldn't be any obstacle to it. In the short term, of course, there are obstacles. I always deplored that in times when, for example, the United States, with the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq, the war against Saddam Hussein, was not using this kind of activities which have been more or less in agreement, or let's say in some sort of a parallel thinking with Iran, because Iran was not happy about the Taliban regime. Iran was not happy about Mr. Saddam Hussein. He was the guy who attacked Iran. So that this possibility has not been really used to find new terms with Iran. Of course, we have a very different concept about some of the human rights issue, you know, perfectly well, and also about the situation in the Middle East, not only in concerning Israel, but also Syria, the support for Mr. Assad. I think maybe regionally was some, let's say, has some reason, but I think it was not really helping to overcome the situation in Syria and in Libya and so on. So in Lebanon and so on. So I don't have to come again. I think one would have to find some elements where cooperation could be established. I think, for example, concerning Afghanistan. Again, as far as I know, the US is very much blocking support for the poor people and the people who are starving in Afghanistan. I think on this issue, as the US left all of a sudden and forced other European countries to leave all of a sudden, we see a horrible situation in Afghanistan. And of course, still many refugees. I don't know how many refugees now are coming or returning, but I think here the cooperation concerning the neighboring country, Afghanistan, could be very helpful. Concerning, as I said, the Middle East, also a dialogue about the situation in all the countries I mentioned should come up. Maybe with the help also of some Arab countries where Iran is now establishing an improved relationship. I think Europe is much too cautious and too hesitant to go for that kind of cooperation, which could be, of course, first perhaps more on the scientific level, as a discussion here, but of course with people who are in the different institutes. I think what we saw with Russia, of course, the different approach we have to democracy, to human rights, to neighborhood, should not prevent to start a stronger dialogue where also some basic trust could be built up. But of course, it must come from both sides. That's very important. We see that the breakdown of relationship is not helping anybody. And I would appreciate if some of the scientific institutes would start more discussion. I would appreciate if the European Union would call on the institutes, on European institutes, to start that kind of dialogue and to promote that kind of dialogue. I don't see results very soon of this dialogue, but this dialogue is enabling, let's say, an improvement in the situation in the midterm and in the long run. And for example, the question of disarmament and the arms control or whatever in the region could be one in general, without always referring only to the nuclear issue. It's part of it, but it's not the only one. I think the whole situation on the environment, on energy transition, because all countries more or less must go in some way in energy transition, energy supply, but also finally an energy transition is an enormous one. Also the refugee issue, of course. So there are many issues where I think dialogue should start again. It's more or less interrupted, much more than it was in the past, which is sad. Yeah, I think we should not deny the differences there are, but the differences should not prevent to have a stronger dialogue. And I think that's could be useful for both sides, absolutely.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Next question is from my other colleague, Ms. Hojati from the French program. Ms. Hojati, okay, now you're.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Thank you for your presentation. As you know, during last years, Europeans have had initiatives to promote regional de-escalation in the Persian Gulf and ensure freedom of navigation around the Strait of Hormuz. On the other hand, due to Russian invasion of Ukraine, Europe is seeking to strengthen its energy ties with Middle Eastern suppliers to overcome its dependence on Russian oil and gas. Considering these 2 points, and also importance of Persian Gulf and especially Hormuz Strait for Iran, what do you think about future relations between Iran and Europe based on maritime security and also energy security? Thank you.
Well, thank you for your questions. Again, I think we should see the European Union with the whole region has to have an improvement in the relationship because of the energy issue, but not only because of the energy issue, because I think, as I mentioned, it's also the environmental issue. We have to be careful in general to combine a policy of looking for more energy and sanctioning Russia and the free passage in the sea, because there are some ideas of taking tankers with Russian oil and hijacking them if they are exporting it. So we should be very careful, because I think you have to stick to international law and not because it's your interest to deviate from it. So the free passage, I think, must be guaranteed, and we should do everything not to escalate the war, but to reduce the war and to come at least to a truce for the moment, and then to some sort of a peace agreement in the longer term. Looking at that, of course, as you said, the Strait of Hormuz, the Persian Gulf, all this area is of great importance, and the European Union should work together. The more, of course, Iran is also cooperating with other countries in the region. As I said, in the first step, of course, with the Arab countries, the easier it is for European Union to be part of that cooperation, or to promote the cooperation, or to promote cooperation between European Union and Iran. And of course, let's say that the nuclear agreement is decided and implemented. I deplore very much that this kind of cooperation, which could be a very good one, environmental issues, also in scientific issues. We know that Iran has very strong scientific capacities, which could be used for peaceful purposes. So I think the cooperation between Iran and the European Union could be an excellent one if some of the obstacles, as mentioned before, are overcome. And I think even in helping the economic development in Lebanon could be an issue of cooperation if both sides have a joint plan how to help the country. The same is, of course, true for Iraq. It's a bit more difficult for the cooperation concerning the reconstruction in Syria. Maybe in the long term also one possibility could be found together with Iran and Iraq and other countries in the region. As long as Syria is in the state as it is, and there is no real strong reconstruction for its citizens and all its citizens, if they are Sunnis, Shias, if they are Kurds or Yazidis or whoever, there will be also always be an open wound, and out of open wound always there can be an infection in the neighborhood. So as difficult as it is for the West to do anything for Syria as long as Mr. Assad is president, I think ways have to be found to treat this wound in Syria and to help the citizen. It can be done if the neighboring countries in the region work together on this issue. And in general, this is my opinion. If you take issues which are on general interest, as I said, the environment, as I said, the stability in countries like Syria or Lebanon, and go for a joint plan where everybody has to make compromises and everybody has to take a step back. It's always this kind of ideas you can win. Hezbollah cannot win in Lebanon without having an agreement with the other parts of the country. The same is true for Iraq. The one group cannot win without the help of the other country. It's so split. It's not, you know, one dominant split. Even you see in Yemen, there is no real winner. There are only losers. All the time, only losers. And therefore, I think the question is, all the countries have to think, how can we win together? Or how can the citizens win? If that is the major impact, then I think it's much easier to find a solution. If one only thinks, how can I win? It will not help. Some people will get rich, but I don't know if that's the purpose of our policies, to make some people rich and the rest poor.
Thank you very much. I think the questions that, I don't know if other people have questions, please raise their hands. If not, we're going to, I just wanted to ask one last question. Of course, I do not know whether you would like to give a direct answer to that or not, considering all these obstacles and differences that exist in the security cooperation. And regarding the fact that Europe is now more concerned with the war in Ukraine and the security threats in Eastern Europe, how much willingness do you see? And of course, there isn't much progress on the nuclear negotiations. How much willingness do you see to still continue cooperation, regardless of the fact that these obstacles exist, and willingness to, as you mentioned, to remove some of the sanctions to somehow build trust and prepare the grounds for further cooperations in the future?
In some way, of course, it depends on the course of the war. If the war ends relatively soon, I mean, in some months' time, then of course we can expect that all the other areas will be more on our attention. But I think even when the war is going on, we have to recognize, as I said before, that not all the countries are much interested in the Ukraine war. For them, it's far away and they are not affected or only negatively affected because of higher prices for their food. And we have a food crisis already in the world, and it is deteriorating. Somebody said for any price rise of 1%, we have 10 million more people going into poverty. So that's not what we can care for. And therefore, I think in any way, the interest for the Middle East will come back sooner or later and will be stronger. And even if the war is going on, the European Union must know that with all their pride about quick answer, strong answer, with all this self-consciousness European has won, globally, we are not the masters of the world. Nobody is. Globally, we need alliances, we need support. And globally, we, of course, support from big decisive countries who can make nuisance or can help. And Iran is one of those countries because it's not a small country, it's a big country. And again, in a very fragile area. So my guess would be that European Union will come back with a strong interest in the region. Of course, with a nuclear agreement, it is easier and will promote it much more. And therefore I hope for it, even if there are obstacles now, but it would be very clever, irrespective, or even in that time, just at that time to do it, to come to an agreement. And again, quickly after the agreement, we must start cooperation with Iran. We should not forget leave the time pass by until another president is coming, or the same president who canceled the agreement is coming back, which is possible. We saw a recent election in Ohio was disastrous for Democrats, and a new alliance from Mr. Trump. So immediately afterwards, we should start from both sides to have a closer cooperation on some of the issues. We cannot solve all the issues. We will have many differences, but I think it would be important to have a strong cooperation between the region of European Union and the region of the Middle East, and inside the Middle East, of course, also with Iran, and Iran with other countries in the region. Yes, it will come. I hope sooner than later. And again, if we can find a new nuclear agreement, it would be much more helpful.
Yes, that's right. I was going to say that was the last question, but seems that it was the second to last. We have one more question. If you will, I just hope that you can answer this one, and we will finish at 2 o'clock in Tehran, perhaps at what time is it in Vienna?
It's 11:30.
Okay, so
4 minutes is 11:30.
okay, so a few more minutes, if you will. Mr. Hadian from the US program, please.
Dear Dr. SWOBODA, greetings and thank you for your brilliant explanation on the contemporary situation in Europe and MENA. Regarding the solution you suggested about the Syrian conflict, well, Iran is taking much of the blame for supporting the Assad government to stay in power. However, I see little appetite for a change of regime in Syria from Israel or Saudi Arabia or the UAE. They wouldn't want a Muslim Brotherhood government in Syria. And meanwhile, we had the precedence of sitting ambassadors of Western countries in 2011 and 2012 asking for the quitting of the sitting government of Syria. So we have a complicated situation. What is your practical solution for conflict resolution in Syria? If you were to suggest a mechanism for conflict resolution in Syria, considering the circumstances that you have a ruling elite which controls most of the territory, and considerations from Iran, Israel, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and meantime, you have the European Union with its human rights concerns. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, of course, it's a complicated issue, and you know that the West in general was not, is accused by some of the groups who were fighting against Assad that they were not supported enough by the West, in difference to what happens in Ukraine. Of course, I was speaking with some of these leaders myself at that time in Amman, but we had the problem that part of the leaders were Muslim brothers or whatever Salafist or whatever extreme groups, terrorist groups. Others were democratic groups, and it was not easy for us to decide who is who. And it was not easy to decide to send weapons when we don't know who gets the weapons at the end in that civil war. Was it good to start the war? No, it was not good, but it wasn't started by the West. It was started by people inside with more support even from some Arab countries than from us. Nevertheless, I think the Assad regime is a brutal regime. And what is even more, now that we have a narcotic regime and a regime of many extremely corrupt people. What can be done? I think what could be done is if the countries involved in the neighborhood, and I would for the moment exclude even Russia now, but the countries involved in the neighborhood sit together and say, how can we help the citizens? How can we reconstruct parts of Syria without that the money is going to some of the corrupt leaders in the country? I would not say, it's not about the political recognition of Assad or whatever. There are countries who never broke the diplomatic relationship, including Austria, even if our ambassador had to flee and go to Beirut. But that could be possible, for example, with the help of international organizations. But I think there must be a strict control that this money is not helping to sustain a corrupt network in that country and corrupt regime. So there could be some cooperation, slowly, part by part, involving companies also from the region, from the different sides, but with some sort of a cost control. There is a possibility. But when we sit have together and let's say not working against the regime, of course, that's not the issue. We're not here to work against the one or the other regime or one or the other government, but to help the citizen with some of the investments. Schools could be reconstructed, water and other kind of infrastructure could be reconstructed. Citizens could get food or could help to build up a new job, new shops, whatever. Small things, but where we could help and get not the accusation that we have the regime, but we have the people. And not fighting against the regime, but accepting that it is here. That's a fact of life, that it is here. But the fact of life is that people are still suffering.
Thank you. Mr. HADIAN has raised his hand again. I just want to ask him if you agree to keep the comments short.
Okay.
Yes, Mr. HADIAN, please just keep it short so that he would, Mr. SWOBODA would have enough time to.
Thank you, dear Dr. SWOBODA. What the practical situation is that you have a sitting government in Damascus that is exercising control and sovereignty over most of the Syrian territory on one hand. And on the other hand, there is little appetite for regime change in Syria. The Iranians don't want a regime change. The UAE doesn't want a regime change. The Saudis don't want a regime change. The Israelis don't want a regime change. However, reconstructing Syria without dealing with the question of the international recognition of the sitting government in Damascus from Europe and the United States. How is this going to be possible? Because you suggest a civil society-based approach, but reconstructing a war-ridden country requires working with some sort of central authority and sovereign. How, when there's no appetite for regime change in the region, yet we have this insistence on not recognizing the sitting government in Damascus. How is the Syrian crisis going to be solved? Because it appears to be a paradoxical situation in practical terms. I'm not judging anyone.
I don't agree. Of course, it's not easy. First of all, many countries don't have to recognize the regime, because if they didn't break a diplomatic relationship, the regime is there. We don't, for example, my country never recognize regime or not recognize a country, and the country is there, and who is the president is the president. So I think this is not a big issue. Secondly, I think that you can work together with the different regional authorities. If they are authorities run by Assad or not, is not a big issue. And for example, if some of the countries, including the Emirates, have now better relationship with Assad, maybe Mr. Assad could be interested that the country is reconstructed and the citizens see some benefits. Because at the end of the day, citizens will not be happy with the regime. So I think there are still ISIS and there are still some extreme forces there, but more or less they are beaten. The bigger issue is, of course, the Kurds and other regions, and Turkey, of course, is not interested to have a, let's say, regional government there or strong there. So it's not about, let's say, fighting against the regime or not recognizing. For example, again, my country, there's an ambassador, even he's not sitting, I don't know if he's sitting already in Damascus and other countries as well. It's not nothing we don't have to declare, we recognize. Mr. Assad is there, and that's it. Countries who said Mr. Assad should go maybe have to recognize, who have broken the relationship, but it's not, for some countries, it's not the issue. Secondly, it can be done, of course, it could be done by international organizations. The UN does not have to say recognize or not. They can organize help and support. They need the money and they need, of course, nobody to block it. But if there can be some agreement, internal agreement that Mr. Assad is allowing things to develop and some work is done for reconstruction, and it is done in a decent way, and it's done in a way, you know, his people around him anyway have so a lot of money, they don't need new money. They have already enough. And of course, one has to stop, if the reports are true, the narcotic trade, which cannot be interested also with some of the neighbors. I know how sensitive, for example, Iran is. So again, it could be done. There could be even some cooperation with some companies coming from Iran and doing a job like reconstruction of roads, reconstruction of houses, reestablishing some economic infrastructure and so on. So if the willingness is here, it could be done. Of course, if Mr. Assad says, first you have to come with me and to speak with me, it will not work. If he says, look, do a good job, so that my citizens are happy, and don't fight against me, but have a, let's say, normal relationship one has with leaders, even leaders we don't like. We have a diplomatic relationship with the North Korean leader. We don't like him, but we have it. So this, I don't think it's a real obstacle. It's not, we should not always concentrate on the regime change, neither in the West nor from their side. Yes, it was an interest in regime change. We had an interest in having some sort of a new government who would involve many others. But for the moment, this is not the issue. I think for the moment, it's the only issue is, could we help people there? It's a bit like also in Afghanistan. I think we should we should not forget the citizens who are suffering from the different regimes because we don't like the regime. I think there are always ways, for example, by international organizations to help the citizens, but we should not block it. And I think for the moment, it's more the US still probably blocking it in Afghanistan and in Syria. But I think slowly we should go in the direction of helping the Syrian people.
Thank you very much. Of course, I think I know that the discussion and the topics are really interesting. We could go on talking for many hours, but of course, I'm afraid the time is limited, both for you and of course for the Institute as well. Thank you very much, Mr. SWOBODA, and we hope to have other webinars and discussions like this. If you would like to have any comments, you're all ears. If not, I would wish you a good day and say goodbye to everyone.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. It was very nice to see you again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and goodbye.